But in space, for example, mitochondria is one of those central hubs of dysregulation that I believe, and throughout my work, causes the downstream effects we see. What I've been focusing on is how to potentially look at this microRNA signature as a biomarker for all this, and also using it as a countermeasure. Like, if we inhibit these microRNAs, can we rescue the damage caused in space? Last September, I was recruited to join the University of Pittsburgh, where they wanted to start a whole space biomedicine center, make Pittsburgh a hub potentially of space biomedicine education and research, because space is an accelerated model for a lot of diseases and aging. Mm-hmm. It's an exciting field to be, because there's so much yet to be discovered and work on.
Welcome to the Omar Alayli podcast, your go-to podcast for exploring the diverse fields driving space exploration and technology. I'm your host, Omar Alayli, and today I'm thrilled to be joined by Professor Afshin Beheshti, who is a professor of surgery and computational and systems biology, the director of the Space Biomedicine Program at the University of Pittsburgh, and he's also an associate director at the McGowan Institute of Regenerative Medicine. Professor Beheshti, Afshin, it's a real honor to have you here on the podcast today. Thank you so much for making the time.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. Excited for the discussion.
Afshin, your journey through biomedicine or biomedical research have been incredibly impressive. From cellular biology to microRNAs, cancer, COVID-19, to regenerative medicine, culminating in your current leadership in the space biomedicine. What led you down this fascinating path, and why did you make the transition towards focusing on the unique challenges of human health in space environment?
Yeah, so I don't have a very direct career path, as you probably saw, and I'll discuss. So my path kind of led me from what opportunities arose, as I was going through my career. So I started with physics. I got a PhD in physics. Undergrad, I did high energy physics, so nothing to do with what I'm doing now. So it's basically, look how atoms smash together, and the fundamental of the life and universe and everything is, from the Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. But eventually, in graduate school, I did biophysics in quotes, but mainly looking at how DNA moves through objects, and the physicists, we modeled the whole, how DNA stretches, coils. I didn't care about the bases and biology at that point, the functional pathways and genes. So then after my graduate school, I kind of wanted to have more clinical relevance with humans. So then I made a switch where I did my first postdoc in this institute called Forsyth Institute in Boston, where it's a institute dedicated for oral health and basically oral dental research. Everything related to microbes or teeth and anything else, gums. So, and I only had one biology course my entire life. So, as a physicist, we're kind of known as jack of all trades. As there's a little sign next to my advisor's door, grad school, saying physicists can do electrical engineering, but not as good. Just go down the list. We kind of could do everything, but not as good, because we have the mathematical skills. And I think nowadays more and more, like with biologists, back then biologists had less computational skills or math, but nowadays with the omics and stuff, I think biologists could, younger biologists can do the same thing, kind of a jack of all trades if they really want to put their mind to it. So then I ended up in the oral microbe lab in Forsyth, where then I was applying some of the techniques I knew and learning biology. Mm-hmm. And then after that, kind of going to more where I am now, the second postdoc I did was in this cancer systems biology lab at St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which is associated, also has affiliation with Tufts University, where the director, Lynn Halacki there, she was a physicist too. So we had a similar background, and then she started a whole cancer systems biology lab, where that's where physicists, when they become biologists, we call ourselves cancer system biologists, same with mathematicians and people with computational background. And systems biology is just a term that means, you're apply computational skills with the wet lab, combine everything, look at a top-down approach, and then also have interdisciplinary kind of research that just don't have biologists one category of background. So that's where, and during that time, not only was I working in cancer, she also had a lot of NASA grants, a big one. So that's how I started getting involved with the whole space biology, space biomedicine field, where we're looking at the time, cancer risk associated with space radiation as is one of the health risks, out of many that are there. And then that's how eventually, I ended up at Tufts Medical Center, working on cancer again. And then eventually I joined NASA Ames Research Center in the Silicon Valley area, where initially I was first working on the Gene Lab omics platform, but then
Mm-hmm.
eventually got my own grants. And this is now where, eventually working on mitochondria related. We'll talk about it later, I guess,
Mm-hmm.
microRNA related, but anything related with space related work. In the meantime, I was still working on cancer. And then also when COVID came around, computation people, a lot of things we do is plug and play. So then that's how I've done a lot of COVID and now long COVID work, continue to do that. And then eventually last September, I was recruited to join University of Pittsburgh, where they wanted to start a whole space biomedicine center. So that's where, kind of the logistics logically there is like, yeah, of course, then start working on, it'd be fun to start a whole space biomedicine center, make Pittsburgh a hub potentially of, space biomedicine education and research. And, in addition to some of the other institutes around the world that have it. So then that's where I ended up now. And that's the past 6 months been quickly trying to get the program going. And then also with my philosophy has open science,
Mm-hmm.
large networks, where people, and I think and I've been doing that for a while, but I think one thing that people saw the potential of that, COVID was a bad thing, but the one good thing about COVID was that they saw when you get a large group of scientists together, how science can progress so rapidly and
Okay.
in a beneficial way for humanity. And I've done that for a while, but now more and more people are like, oh yeah, we could do this. And I think space is one of those things. Space research is one of those things you need that. You need the group of large people to work together, put their minds together, because it's such an expensive endeavor. Plus, all the research we do
Mm-hmm.
can benefit from all these different minds and different backgrounds. As we know, all the different biology that changes in space can use that interdisciplinary and large hive mind kind of mentality to be like, let's put our minds together and make it safe for humans to go to space.
Great. That's fascinating. Do you remember an aha moment or maybe a time you had a significant shift in your thinking when you started to apply your terrestrial expertise to the complexities of the space environment?
Oh, well, I mean, initially, yeah, I mean, that was my second postdoc when I started working in that lab where, we were working on the cancer risk associated with space flight. That was kind of my first idea of how, okay, everything we do in the clinic can also apply to space and vice versa. Everything we do in space can, if we figure out some of the biology, because space is an accelerated model for a lot of diseases and
Mm-hmm.
aging. So a lot of the things we do there can maybe if we figure out the biology there, or if we figure out a countermeasure or something that could be a target, that could be the same thing in the clinic. So that was where, the beginnings of how you could start to think about, oh, space is a really relevant thing and can apply to anyone's background, to work on. It doesn't matter what biology or what, clinical aspect you work on, you could jump and work on space. And that was a time where, and then slowly, as we I kept working on more and more things. Like, oh yeah, there's cardiovascular lists, brain issues, CNS risk, central nervous system risk, and you go down the list.
Mm-hmm.
So that was about, yeah, I think that was, during the training of when you're a postdoc, a junior
Mm-hmm.
scientist, that's when, my mind started shifting. Like, oh yeah, I could apply everything I know to there. And even if I don't know it, I could read and learn, because space is such an ever evolving field right now. And there's still so many unknowns with all the health risks out there. So it's an exciting field to be, because there's so much yet to be discovered and work on, so.
True. So, first of all, congratulations on the new Center for Biomedicine here at the University of Pittsburgh. That sounds like a fantastic initiative. Could you tell us more about the driving force behind this program? What's the core mission, and how will it bring together the worlds of biomedical research, space engineering, and space science?
Yeah, sure. So when I joined in September, just the stars were aligning, pun intended. There's at Pittsburgh, we have, as you mentioned, the space engineering, space science. So one of the professors there, his name's Alan George in the engineering department. He's been trying to launch a Pitt space like a kind of initiative or institute for the past 4 years. He's the engineering side. He does a lot of neat engineering work. He has this like large grants from NSF, from the National Science Foundation in the U.S., and then sometimes NASA grants where he's making things that can actually go to space, engineering feats like, electronic components or robotics that can be sent to space.
Mm-hmm.
And then also there's the whole space science, as you mentioned. This is another professor at Pitt called, his name's Mike Ramsey, where he's a geologist and a basic scientist like that, working on things. So he has lots of NASA grants in the past looking at different things related with the fundamentals of what's out there in space, like
Mm-hmm.
geology, asteroids, climate change, everything that happens. So that was existing. So then, they wanted to form Pitt Space Initiative. Of course, they needed a space biomedicine hub too. So that's where just happened to be coming there.
Okay.
So then that's how Pitt Space was launched actually in September when I first arrived. So yeah, you got space engineering where if students wanted to work on non-biomedicine things, they could actually learn how to do their engineering applications for space. And there's already some undergrad courses he's actually started that, you can undergrads can take space engineering specific courses, which is neat. And then the space sciences, that's going to be some courses related with there's already like astrophysics courses, of course, that falls under there, but other things more targeted to what, let's say, the research that applies to now you could do in that field of chemistry, geology and so on. And then the vision for space biomedicine is me, of course.
Mm-hmm.
And that's where, since we don't have any classes yet, but there's a couple of initiatives I'm doing. One is, the universities have sometimes a certificate program where when you're in graduate school, they have a certificate for specialized and special courses.
Mm-hmm.
And it's an easy thing to set up. So, that's one of the low-hanging fruits where I'm in the process of trying to set up a global certificate for space biomedicine program.
Mm-hmm.
So the idea is, as you alluded to also, is like, there's universities out there around the world that teach aerospace medicine or space biomedicine, but they're sparse. They're, scattered around different universities. And there's no one key expert in the entire field. Like, they could try to teach the whole course, but they're not going to be the expert. They have their own expertise like I do. Mm-hmm. So why not bring the whole world together in a sense and have the experts actually teach the courses to all the students around the world? So the idea is like Pittsburgh right now has already a program set up. They've already done the process to set up a whole online degree program. So that infrastructure is there. And other universities are starting to do this too, or some have already done it. Some are getting on board. So what I want to do is set up that global education certificate program where graduate students and higher clinicians, med school students can sign up for this. And through Pittsburgh, then they get the credit of taking it. And I get the actual key experts from around the world teaching. Like I teach some courses, but then there'll be someone from Oxford, there'll be someone from Weill Cornell Medicine, there'll be someone from Japan teaching a course on their expertise, but they're the experts, and we got to unify. Like we have a bunch of modules in their core courses they could take, and then the specific like electives they could take now. So now the key experts, everyone's getting the expertise from the actual experts. Like we even have some astronauts that will be coming in teaching how do you actually do experiments in space. So that's cool, but then the idea is now all the universities that are going to be involved, they have to figure out we give them the blueprint and they incorporate the certificate program into their own university for their credit system. The students will get the credit, but the classes are the same because online it'll be transmitted to, their university. In Italy, there's a few Italian universities that are involved that said, they're figuring out how to set it up. But once it's set up, there's a link there. Their students will be at the same time live or sometimes recorded, depending on time difference. And they'll get the key courses too. So that's the idea where hopefully I could harmonize space biomedicine education around the world. There's even some space companies involved. For example, Axiom Space is very interested. Be like, oh yeah, we could teach about payloads, and then they might even send some of their employees to sign up to take the courses. Because of course, why not? So that's one initiative to set up this whole kind of harmonizing. And then the bigger initiative, which is you can imagine when you set up a whole new PhD program, it takes a little longer and does a lot of moving parts there. So this is kind of the initial push to show the benefit of interest. So the university will say, there's a lot of interest for this, which I think there will be. And in the process, then we could eventually have a actual PhD program at Pittsburgh for space biomedicine. So students can become, like, for example, space doctors, or they could go space, actually have a degree in space biomedicine. As you know, space is going to be like almost a $2 trillion industry in the next decade. So there's going to be no short supply of demand of young minds to get into the field, whether it's industry or academics.
That's a significant undertaking, Afshin. What key elements do you believe are absolutely crucial when you're trying to build such a collaborative and interdisciplinary research hub?
I think having a large network, be open. So that's what I've done. I have lots of people around the world I work with, hundreds in my network, not just space, but let's say COVID, long COVID, or cancer. But, with the space network, I think there's a lot of people. There's already a lot of people working on around the world, but there's a lot of new people that want to be involved somehow. So they have, let's say, for example, one of my colleagues, or a group of my colleagues in Italy and Belgium and other places are interested in exploring oral health in space, which is understudied. What happens to your teeth? What happens to your microbiota in your mouth? It's studied elsewhere, but that these people are specializing in that. So, that's something I wouldn't have thought of or teach, but in the larger global schemes, like we want to look at that, let's research this, and then we can teach the courses to the students. So the key, to your question is having the large network of people, and then being open to just broadcasting the message. And you plant one node, the node spreads, right, like a network, and in a good way. And then more people join the initiative. And then, I mean, there's always a problem when sometimes when you get big, large networks, there's going to be one person that might be, or a group of people that might be problematic. But, those you could just say,
Yeah,
we won't deal with you anymore because we got plenty of other people coming. But
exactly.
that's the key, I think the network, the large network of people is going to be truly how these things get pushed forward. There's a good network of people at Pittsburgh, a lot of faculty there that are really interested and are going to be involved. But again, the expertise there's a lot, but we need more, to get this pushed forward.
Let's dive now into your bread and butter, which is your research delves into the intricate roles of the mitochondria and the microRNAs. For listeners who haven't studied biology, how would you describe mitochondria and mRNAs in everyday term? What are their functions and why are they so vital to our understanding of the human health?
Yeah, sure thing. Yeah, so really simplistically put, mitochondria is a powerhouse of your cell. That's a very simplistic view of it. There's a lot more, but 90% of your body's energy is from all these little organelles in your cells that through evolution, like a mitochondria is thought to be used to be a microbe, a bacteria that evolutionarily thought, oh, these bacteria can really benefit, your biology, not only humans, but animals, plants. So eventually over time, the bacteria become an organelle in your cells, and there's, hundreds of thousands of them in your cell, and they move around, so that's where, in your cell, that's where your ATP, your whole energy production happens. And it creates the energy you need to push forward. Like with mitochondria, though, with age, as one of the main things that help or facilitate the decline of your age is that mitochondrial energy production slowly declines with age. Some people quicker than others, and there's things to maybe to prevent that, like exercising, help boost your mitochondria. So that's one of the things, mitochondria is, and there are mitochondrial diseases on Earth, for example, like mutations that happen. Mitochondria has its own DNA.
Mm-hmm.
So when there's mutations that happen within the DNA, then and it's passed on to the progeny, that could potentially cause issues. Usually mitochondria related diseases might, when you have the decline in energy, a lot of it's kind of related to fatigue or energy, lack of energy, but also things can be related to your vision loss and other things. And some people think there's emerging evidence to say, let's say Alzheimer's or Parkinson's might have a mitochondrial root in there, because when your energy production goes down in your brain, that's a big issue.
Mm-hmm.
Your brain, for example, is 2% of your body mass, but 20% of the mitochondria is in your brain. So you can imagine diseases associated that could attack that, key organelle in the signaling. Really, mitochondria could maybe facilitate a lot of diseases out there to progress. Cancer is another thing, for example, that takes advantage of the mitochondrial, where it would suppress all the mitochondrial energy activity, but it will replace that energy activity with increasing your sugar activity in your body. And cancer likes sugar.
Okay.
So it's called the Warburg effect. And a lot of cancers use that mechanism where it uses that suppression in the mitochondria to dysregulate a lot of metabolic function in your cells with increasing like sugar and creating like a hypoxic environment where cancer thrives. So that's one thing it does. So that's mitochondria. It's you want that to be actively working nicely. And in space, for example, and we get that later, but in space, for example, mitochondria is one of those central hubs of dysregulation that I believe, and throughout my work, causes the downstream effects we see. Now, microRNAs are one form of non-coding RNA.
Mm-hmm.
Last year, you might have heard the Nobel Prize was awarded to the two people who discovered microRNAs, about 20 plus years ago now. So it's relatively new in biology, 20 plus years. It's still kind of an infancy. There's still a lot of unknowns there. So as we know in biology, there's DNA transcribes to RNA, and RNA would translate to proteins, make your proteins, right? So but these non-coding RNAs don't do that. There's a bunch of non-coding RNAs, different types of, and one type of them is a microRNA, which is very small. It's about 22 nucleotides in size. They're very stable since they're so small. And there's a region, an 8-base region in the microRNA that binds to genes.
Okay.
And through that mechanism, it binds to genes and silences them. So one microRNA, for example, could regulate hundreds to thousands of genes in your body. So they're very small, but very useful, or very very active with the biology in your body. And classically, like before the two people who won the Nobel Prize discovered the microRNAs, since of their size, people thought they were just debris, fragments of RNA, and people ignored them. So
Okay.
one person's garbage turned out to be a gold mine of biology that we were ignoring hundreds of years earlier. And then 20 years ago, it's like, wait, this is not garbage, so that's a lesson for the younger generation. Maybe one person, don't ignore anything in biology that could be active. But yeah, so this microRNA, for example, these microRNAs can control hundreds of thousands of genes. So it's basically, I think of a computer, right? So it's your computer, you have the motherboard, and that's your central processing thing that controls it. Once that gets knocked out, your computer's gone. So that's the same thing with microRNAs. I think most diseases would have a signature of microRNAs associated with that disease progression, because due to their size, they also circulate in your body. Every bodily fluid you could think of has the microRNAs floating around. And sometimes they're free floating with this protein attached to them to let them get in and out of cells. Sometimes they're packed in these things called microvesicles, which is like these little blibs that come out of cells that has DNA, proteins, or something microRNAs, or sometimes in your lipids that are floating around. There's microRNAs in there. So there's multiple mechanisms where microRNAs can float around in your body and fluids that exist in your body. And through that, I think if there's for example, cancer, if there's disease, it's not only the local area where you have cancer. I mean, your body is systemically affected. You feel it all when people have cancer. It's all over. So I believe like that disease progression, whether it's cancer, cardiovascular disease, you go down the list, you just have to figure out a microRNA signature. That's the motherboard of that disease. You knock that microRNA signature out, then you potentially could maybe get rid of that disease.
Okay.
So space is the same thing. Space is actually a systemic impact to your body of health risks that occur. But for microRNAs, I do believe there's a microsignature, which I have several papers showing that, potential like 13 microRNA signatures associated with space health, and components of that is related with different cardiovascular function or brain function. So, what I've been focusing on is how to potentially look at this microRNA signature as a biomarker for health, and also using it as a countermeasure. Like if we inhibit these microRNAs, can we rescue the damage caused in space?
Okay. So speaking about space, your work has highlighted the significant impact of spaceflight and space environment on fundamental biological processes and mitochondria and microRNAs. What are the critical factors? Let's start at the high level. What are the critical factors that causes lasting full impact and strain on a microbiological and cellular level due to spaceflight and space environment?
Yeah, so the general thing for spaceflight, as the background most people listening to know, is you have the microgravity. There's several health the NASA had defined like 5 hazards. The 2 main hazards I usually concentrate on is the lack of gravity, right? The microgravity, and then the space radiation, which we're not exposed to here. Those heavy ions that are floating around the background that people will be exposed to in space when they're there. So those are the 2 main effects, that biology that will impact the body. For health risk associated with them, you could imagine there's everything. Like obviously muscle degeneration and bone loss is one of those things that people can think about because of the lack of gravity, but the space radiation itself also impacts that, the constant radiation damage to your muscle and bone. In addition to the lack of gravity, of course, causes more decline or degeneration of it.
Okay, so you've discovered that the spaceflight affects the mitochondria, right? And alters the signature of circulating microRNAs. What do these changes serve as potential biomarkers, or how do these changes serve as potential biomarkers for the health of astronauts exposed to the harsh space environment, particularly regarding space radiation-related damage?
Right, exactly. So that's what through our work, we discovered mitochondria, sort of the central hub of this regulation happening. What would happen is basically what we've shown is, and then we have a more recent paper diving in depth in that, preprints available online right now. The paper's under review. But yeah, so mitochondria, what we show is the space itself, due to the combination of, I think it's more probably radiation than microgravity, but it's definitely a combination of it, where it suppresses that energy production in the cells for mitochondria activity. So that, you can imagine if that suppresses that activity, that could lead to cardiovascular issues, or that I mentioned the brain. They could lead to that whole brain fog or other kind of issues that astronauts sometimes report, depending on how long they've been in space. And then also, of course, mitochondria, like sarcopenia, muscle degeneration, is related with mitochondrial dysfunction too. So that downstream of that, let's say all the energy production done downstream of that will elevate immune dysfunction or immune suppression. So there, for example, in space, people have reported sometimes viral reactivation. Now, a lot of people had chickenpox, for example, right? So that herpes simplex virus, Sometimes, luckily, I don't think there's been any cases of that chickenpox being reactivated, but other milder forms of cold sores like that become reactivated, those viral things. EBV, the Epstein-Barr virus, sometimes is being reactivated. So that's one consequence of your mitochondrial being suppressed. You're more prone to potentially have infections or getting sick or the reactivation of these viruses. So that's not a good thing, especially in a long-term mission, right? And then, of course, everything else you could think of, if you long-term, not maybe in space, but when astronauts come back, if there's continued suppression, what we've shown, for example, not only in space do we get the suppression of mitochondrial activity, the energy production is down. This seems to be long-term afterwards to come back, the mitochondria is still suppressed, so that means your energy, you can think of, for example, like chronic fatigue syndrome. It's probably a mitochondrial driven thing because people are in that disease, people are constantly tired. Some are not even functional because of that whole energy production. Their body's not working. So it's at different degrees.
So it's not a switch.
No.
Like you leave the environment, it goes back.
No. The hope is it would be, but no. Unfortunately, I mean, some things are. Some other pathways do come back within a couple of days or a week. But for the mitochondria, what we're seeing is even months later, things seem to start coming back, but there's still that suppression we see in the mitochondrial activity. We don't have any data points yet to look a year later, which hopefully we'll get from, let's say, astronauts or, let's say, mouse experiments. But my hypothesis would be hopefully eventually, just based on, for example, let's say, Scott Kelly, who was in space for a year, one of the longest ones, right? I mean, in his book, he even talks about where, it took him a while to feel back to normal, like 9 months, to be like, I feel myself again. So maybe I would potentially contribute that to the mitochondrial dysfunction that constantly what his body is trying to, look at. We've looked at a lot of the data from with my collaborator, Chris Mason, where we definitely, the mitochondrial suppression was there. It's N of 1, right? It's one astronaut compared to his twin Mark Kelly. Obviously on Earth, he was normal health throughout the mission on Earth, and he didn't have any mitochondrial dysfunction. But when you looked at Scott Kelly's data and even followed him up like for about a year, not a year, but it was about 100 days afterwards, that mitochondrial suppression was still there, happening. And it looked like it was coming back up. So it makes sense when his book says it took me like approximately 9 months to feel 100% back to normal. I bet that's probably due to your mitochondria trying to recover from that extreme environment and the damage caused. So that's like an example there. And I'm sure those two astronauts that just came down after almost 9 months, a little longer, 9 months. I'm sure if we had been able to get samples from them, which we didn't, I'm sure their mitochondria would be interesting to look at because, it'd be interesting to hear a year from now how long it takes them to get feeling back to where they used to be pre-flight.
Yeah. True. In your research and papers, you mentioned 6 fundamental features like oxidative stress, DNA damage, mitochondrial dysregulation, epigenetic changes, telomeral length alteration, and microbiome shifts. Which do you believe has the most immediate or severe impact on astronaut health?
That's a good question. I don't know if it's, well, I'm biased. So when you look at mitochondria, you become a mitochondriac. So everything's mitochondria. But I don't know if that's what everyone will agree with me. But I think for me, being biased, I'll say probably the mitochondria is probably the key hit first, where your mitochondria gets in disarray and then has all the downstream impact. Because, of course, mitochondria would cause oxidative stress. Like if your suppression happens in your energy production, usually reactive oxygen species are produced, which helps that oxidative stress activity. So that's connected there. And like for the rest of the immune dysfunction and the other things you mentioned, it has a link to mitochondrial dysfunction to happen. Even the telomere, our collaborator Susan Bailey, who's in Colorado State University, she's the one who's really pioneered the whole telomere research that's been happening in the field. And she started it by looking at Scott Kelly's data, and they saw, you probably saw, oh, your telomeres get longer, right? And especially Scott Kelly came back, he was obviously 2 inches taller too. So like, go to space, telomeres get longer, you get taller, you're getting younger, because telomeres, for the audience, if they don't know, is the caps of the chromosome. And as you grow older, it gets shorter and shorter because that's the decline of age is causing your decline of your genetics and things like that. So if your telomeres are getting longer, it means that you technically are getting younger. But that's not the case, so obviously you don't go to space and get younger. So unfortunately, so that's the part with telomeres. It was interesting finding she found, and then she's actually reproduced that in other astronauts, even shorter missions. They see the telomere, but when they come back, it gets back to normal.
Okay.
And there might be links, like recently, some colleagues have been talking about why it gets longer. That's the part of the research. There's some indication potentially it could be due to some mitochondrial mechanisms causing that to get longer. I won't say more about it because we're just kind of starting to think about it, and I might come up with ideas there that might be wrong. So
Okay, no worries.
but that's the part we're trying to work on. So it might not be really mitochondrial, but I think there's some mitochondrial link there that will maybe in a year have some data to be like, oh, here it is, and then. But I think all those 6 features are related to mitochondrial. But what like the microbial shifts though, that's I think that probably happens within the same time frame. It could be independently happening that influences each other. So microbes, of course, don't have mitochondria. Since mitochondria was from a microbe, but mitochondrial dysfunction can influence microbial change, and vice versa. Microbial changes that happen can impact your mitochondrial changes.
Okay.
Right. So your energy production. So we know, let's say in space, astronauts' gut microbiome changes because of that environment. That happening. Yeah, the question is what happens first. I think a lot of them would happen all together. Like epigenetic changes too can be related to mitochondrial dysfunction, but epigenetic changes can be related to a lot of different things, causing like your circadian rhythm or age, the epigenetic clock, of your aging. That could change, and it could be upstream or downstream of everything there. So DNA damage is definitely something that had happened probably right away, right? Because when you get so just a little background there, like when you're exposed to radiation, whether it's the type of radiation on Earth, the gamma or X-rays, which is very different from the radiation you get in space. The space radiation is about like 5 to 10 times more damaging than you get on Earth with the same dose due to the biology. But a DNA damage, when let's say you get gamma or these heavy ions like an iron particle or a proton, it's like a track going through your cell like that. It's causing physical DNA damage happening. Usually then you have proteins in your body, DNA repair proteins will come and repair them. But having constant DNA damage is not a good thing, right? Because this, for example, cancer, some people think has persistent DNA damage will cause mutations eventually, misrepair of your DNA to cause mutations, and then the cells will be abnormal, and that could potentially cause cancer. That's one consequence of that. Or there's other health risks too. So, the moment you get exposed to radiation, that happens right away. So now you're exposed to that stress that maybe some of these other key hallmarks or functions, can be over time. You're exposed to DNA damage right away, and how your body reacts to that, you might not see it right away, but you'll see the long-term consequence if you're exposed to it for a long time.
Great. Let's shift gears now to microRNAs. Could you tell us more about your research on antagomeres and their potential to repair microRNAs related damage caused by spaceflight?
Yeah, definitely. So, as I mentioned earlier, microRNAs, we figure out a signature associated with space flight. And so far, what we looked at out of the signature, 13 microRNA signature, 3 of them I said should be associated with cardiovascular health risk and microvascular functions. So through my collaborator, you could have these tissues on a chip, or like you can make these 3D organoid models that represents part of your body, like from human-derived cells. So unfortunately, they don't let us irradiate a human through the simulators for good reason. So the best next thing is to create kind of a in vitro or cell model that could simulate that organ. So there's a lot of different work that other people do and we've done. What started this off was we had one of my collaborators at Columbia University, which unfortunately he passed away of cancer this past year, but he developed a microvasculature 3D structure that you could grow in a dish. It derived from endothelial cells. And there's no blood flow through them, but they form the whole structures of your vessel, so it looks nice like that. A very simple model. And when you irradiate them on Earth to simulate space radiation, there's a place on Long Island called New York called Brookhaven National Lab. It's a high energy physics collider. And there's places around Europe that have these too. So, but the high energy physics collider is the basic physics experience. You create these heavy ions that are similar to space. So NASA had set up a NASA Space Radiation Laboratory at Brookhaven National Lab in the early 2000s, where you could take part of the beam and now you could expose cells, mice, or whatever you want in front of there and have to simulate the whole space radiation. Iron particles, protons are doing mix. So we go there usually to simulate what happens in space for the space radiation. So we expose these 3D microvasculature models derived from humans, cells that when you radium like the galactic cosmic ray, a dose that's, let's say, a acute dose is equivalent to, let's say, if you go to Mars and come back, which is about a year trip, the vessels collapse. And over time, it's just a lot lower dose. So you can imagine your micro vessels, in your body, if you went to Mars, they'll start causing enough damage and some of them might collapse, in your body. So indeed, the microRNA signature related to cardiovascular was actually there. It was upregulated. These microRNAs were there and seemed to be relating to this mechanism. So then you could buy inhibitors that could an antagonist sequence to a microRNA. It's very small, the microRNAs. So there's companies out there that make things called antagomeres, which is the inhibitors to the microRNAs. Okay. Basically, antagonist. So microRNA is a single strand floating in your body. All you need is someone to have some technology where they could create the opposite sequence and bind to those microRNAs. Because remember, I said the microRNAs, since they're single-stranded, will bind to genes, and that's cause inhibition. So if you have a bunch of floating microRNAs in your body that's associated with this like health risk of cardiovascular disease close to space, if you make them inert by creating an inhibitor bind to them, now they can't bind to your genes and inhibit those genes that are going to cause detrimental issues in your body.
Okay.
So there's companies out there like there's one in Philadelphia called AUM LifeTech that they've created this antagomere where it's kind of a self-delivery system where they've through additions they made to like a antagonist sequence, they put this like lipid-derived technology in the size that lets it get in and out of cells. There's other.
What's the delivery mechanism for?
So it's they call it FANA, F-A-N-A, but what it is, they put lipids. It's very oversimplifying what they've done, but they create lipids in there where now it allows it to get in and out of the cell. Or if
okay. But for as a human being, how's the delivery method? Is it through a pill, injection?
So right now there's no like FDA approved thing. So for what we just do right now, let's say for our mice experiments, it's just like an IP injection. You just go like that, right? And then that gets in your circulation, and then we'll find those antagonist sequence and bind to them. Or in cell culture, we just mix it in the media and it gets in there. So for humans, eventually, if this becomes a drug for humans, not only for space but for clinic, you could just give it an injection. Maybe someone will come up with a pill. That's the pharmaceutical side to do it. But definitely, you could just do it like a normal, injection, like you do anything else. Nothing fancy, nothing painful.
Okay. So how might this approach revolutionize conditions like cancer and long COVID here on Earth?
Yeah, exactly. So then, since it seems like we're rescuing the damage caused by space radiation by doing that, like we saw that it really mitigates. It's the same idea. So if you have a signature associated with microRNAs related to cancer, and you've done all the legwork to show that indeed this microRNA is truly associated with that, then you could actually inhibit those microRNAs itself. Like I won't call it a vaccine, but you would target those specific microRNAs associated with that, and then potentially that could rescue. Let's say for cancer, some of the work I've done early on with lymphoma, I figured out a similar microRNA signature associated with diffuse large cell B lymphoma cancer. And we did the legwork. We had a mouse models. We confirmed, indeed, this was there. We looked at patients. It was, and interestingly enough, the data from the mouse model this mouse model, for example, when they were young, genetically they modified the mice so when they're like 13 months of age, all mice form, or older, they form the cancer. So it's equivalent like a 20-year-old identical to another 20-year-old. Nothing, you don't detect cancer there, but then when they're 50, that group that has prone to that will have diffuse large B-cell lymphoma. That's the mouse model. So it was interesting that the microRNA signature was in that 20-year-old version of a mouse, right?
Okay.
So the idea is, if my idea is right, then there should be a microRNA signature that's driving constantly in your body to eventually the cancer 30 years later to form. So one, it could be a biomarker, like let's say for cancer or some other diseases. So early on, and then, since there's no detectable cancer at that 20-year-old, the best way, again, with my hypothesis, the best way to prevent it is stop these microRNAs from circulating in your body, right?
Okay.
Because maybe it's driving that. So then you do the antagomere injection, and then you basically get rid of those microRNAs there, and eventually you might have to get continued injections, or it might be something that you might, again, this is all work we have to do as hypotheticals. I have to get money.
Exactly. We have to remind our audience that this is not FDA approved. This is all still.
Not FDA approved anything. So, these things take time. So
okay, of course.
But that's the part where through the space work I'm doing, and space biomedicine work, I think is going to be a really good proof of principle to, even in COVID, for example, I've identified potential microRNA associated that the virus promotes to drive that. And long COVID, I think, might be the continuous thing of these microRNAs, because long COVID is a huge issue for, of course, the world. People who, unfortunately, experience that, it's a mitochondrial disease. But if it's a microRNA related thing, maybe that's the key. You got a biomarker, and then you got a potential target for it.
Okay.
But there could be a lot of things. I'm sure maybe Alzheimer's is a micro. There are microRNAs associated with Alzheimer's that people have shown.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe those are good targets to inhibit and see what happens. And there's people looking at it different ways to target these microRNAs. But I think this through space, we definitely might have an accelerated way of viewing some of these things as you implied.
Yeah. Could you provide some insights into the specific goals and approaches of these projects aimed at mitigating the adverse effects of spaceflight, such as mitochondrial dysfunction and microRNA modulation?
Yeah, sure thing. So for the NASA funded stuff, I've had past NASA grants, and actually, the first usually a lot of the grants out the microRNA world is kind of hard to get funding for because a lot of people don't think it's hard or don't believe that what I just told you about microRNAs to be true drivers. I think the Nobel Prizes that won last year will help that field to progress and see the potential of that. But one of the first grants I got to work on microRNAs was one of a NASA grant that I got. Actually, a couple of NASA grants where we're identifying the whole goal was to identify a microRNA signature was really a spaceflight and do all the integument experiments. And it worked, so that was great. The current NASA grants that I have now, of course, not only looks at microRNAs, but mitochondria. One of them, for example, I'm looking at the not just space radiation or microgravity, but one of the concerns in space is when people do the extravehicular activity, like in a spacesuit, go outside, or in future moon mission, right? They're on the moon. They're going to have like 8-hour exertions all day in their spacesuit doing science and research, and then they go back to their, the habitats that they have up there to actually then decompress. But when you're in the EVAs, you have things like hypobaria, meaning like you have pressure changes in there that you won't experience on the ISS or the shuttle, and then you get these hypoxic kind of events happening that after 8 hours can be very tolling on your body. Like it could cause cognitive issues and other things that people are concerned about. So that's one of the NASA grants I'm looking at is how does your mitochondria and your brain change and what microRNAs may be associated with that when you're exposed to that environment. So with some of my collaborators, they have these mini pig models that are kind of simulates that through their high altitude research they do, similar to in the EVA. So that's one research. And then one more recent grant I have is looking at, again, really at the moon, is the regolith. So the regolith is the moon dust, right? So from the Apollo missions, people knew that, they didn't do the biology research back then, but people knew that regolith, when they went back into the shuttle or the spacecraft, it's very fine powder. They take it out, it gets everywhere in the atmosphere. So the issue is now what happens when you inhale it, So there's some studies done that, but there's not too much studies done on understanding the biology, So that's one of the grants I have. So in that grant, we're looking at the liver impact of inhalation on the mitochondria and what microRNAs could be associated. And can we apply integumenters, or we have other AI ML tools, for example, to use FDA approved drugs to target potential microRNAs. So repurposing drugs. Creating an integument human trial might take 10 years, right?
Yeah.
But in the meantime, we have an AI ML tool that could potentially have FDA approved drugs that can repurpose. It won't be as clean, but you can actually then kind of do the same thing, So that's what we're looking into now, where how does regolith, the moon dust, impact your biology, and is it related with mitochondrial microRNAs, which I think it is. So, and then how do you mitigate that damage? Because what they're estimating by 2030 or maybe earlier, they want to get back to the moon, right? So that's going to be a bigger concern more and more, and they're going to spend a long time on there, exposed to that regolith constantly when you go in and out of doing their EVA missions. And there's another NASA grant how we're looking at the bigger data, where there's a lot of omics data from proteomics, lipidomics. So there's a lot of big data there from astronauts from the past 2 or 3 decades. And we got a grant to actually now analyze this data and really use our techniques. Of course, I do a mitochondrial specific pipeline analysis to this. And that's another proposal. We're kind of looking at high altitude impact, which is kind of related to space, and other like cardiovascular risk related to different impact. And hopefully more future grants come. A lot of things they worry about there is trauma, right? Obviously, traumatic events.
Great. From your perspective, what are some of the most crucial or critical health and safety challenges that needs to be addressed for future space missions? How do considerations change when we are talking about also short, medium duration lunar missions versus long duration flights to Mars?
Yeah, I would say probably everything. No, that's a short answer. I mean, the short duration missions, like say to the moon,
Mm-hmm.
that's easier because if they, well, right now it's like 3 days, right? They go back and come back
Mm-hmm.
3 4 days, but eventually, like they're gonna have like 30 days on the moon missions where they come
Mm-hmm.
back. So that, again, now you're exposed to that whole deep space radiation where you're not on the ISS, right? Because of the magnetic field, you get a lower dose of radiation because of the physics. Now you're in the moon, you get the full brunt of the radiation out there.
Plus reflective radiation from the lunar surface.
Exactly, and that too. So I mean, there are, luckily on the moon there might be potential ways, like when they're in their habitats they create, to
Mm-hmm.
maybe reduce the radiation, because some people are like, oh, you could actually use that regolith moon dust if you put a coating on to reduce
Mm-hmm.
the deep space radiation. Now the reflective one, how do you get rid of that? We gotta figure that out. So there could be ways to maybe slow down the damage of deep space.
Mm-hmm.
So in a 30-day mission, like I would imagine, a lot of things might come back to normal once they come back to Earth, so after, again, a period of time. But I guess the biggest issues there would be one of the muscle generation and bone loss, of course. They need to be functional there, but also your cognitive issues, right? Your brain,
Mm-hmm.
like, you could have cardiovascular risk, other things too, like kidney stone formation, for example, is a risk and a concern that could happen in space. And 30 days, like if you get a kidney stone formation in that 30 days, you can still come back to Earth and maybe it won't be a problem. But for cognitive issues, if you start not being able to function and do the mission and not being able to think properly, that's a huge thing to really consider. I mean, in my opinion. But now you go to Mars, a deep space mission. Now of course, that's at least a year. You're going to be in space, if not longer, right?
Yeah, and
So
there's no contingency to come back if something
exactly,
like it's a year and that's it.
exactly, yeah. So right now, I think it's sort of a one-way ticket. You go there, you know, and I'm sure there's astronauts that know about this and they sign up because the human sense of exploration is great.
Mm-hmm.
But unless we come up with some magic pill or countermeasure, I'm thinking maybe a mitochondrial type countermeasure, which we're working on, or microRNA related ones, was said.
Yeah, I was.
Yeah, it's gonna be tough for an astronaut to get there functional due to all the. Yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Speaking about that, you're exploring the potential of specific supplements targeting mitochondria as a countermeasure against space travel induced damages. What are some of the promising findings in this area? Will such approach have a positive snowball health effect to cellular health, organ health, then to the well being of astronauts?
Yeah, exactly. All the above. So one of the right now, one of the supplements, like mitochondrial supplements we're looking on, is a supplement called Camphorol, and
Mm-hmm.
it's funded by this Japanese company Otsuka, which is they created. So Camphorol is a natural product found in grapefruit, leafy greens, lentils,
Mm-hmm.
and there's already supplements out there you could buy from. You see Camphorol. And what they've done is modify it so a little bit to make it more potent, easier to get in your cells, and easier to get the effects of it. So camphorol is an antioxidant, and naturally. The ones you buy right now, I don't think are as effective just because of the modification that they've done isn't there. But so as an antioxidant, it also, what it does is target your mitochondrial biogenesis. So, in space, your mitochondrial biogenesis is suppressed as,
Mm-hmm.
like, let's say, a lot of diseases on Earth, like COVID and cancer and the things it would do.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, the sound of it, biogenesis, that suppression of making new mitochondrial that's damaged, and you can't replace the damaged mitochondrial. It's a bad thing, right? So camphorol tends to boost that and reduce oxidative stress. So we've been testing camphorol from mouse experiments, assembly experiments on Earth, those cell, organoid, human 3D, cell models where we have. And so far, what we've shown is we're processing the data as we're going, and some of the preliminary data is in our preprint that you can see. We've been able to restore, for example, in the mice when they're exposed to that big space radiation damage,
Mm-hmm.
the livers are significantly reduced with a week after radiation. So, the only time your liver weight will reduce like that is if you have like cirrhosis or something that's drastic over a long periods of time. Remember, I said space is an accelerated amount of diseases. So
Mm-hmm.
accelerate that week. But you give it camphorol, there's no change in weight. I was like, in the mice, I was like, oh, well, it's mitochondrial. The liver is really involved with heavy metabolic functions and mitochondrial functions. And then we say have an organoid model, same kind of things. So far, and then we have other models that relate to the heart. We seem to be restoring some functions there, and brain and other things. We're working on data. It seems positive. So I think that could be one cocktail or one
Okay.
version supplement you could take.
So,
Yeah.
could you also explain the potential role of cellular material transfer via tunneling nanotubes in this context? Could we have like a biological shield for long duration missions?
I think that'd be tough because the issue is, I know some people are working on it, as you probably know too, but the issue is you can't physically prevent, well, we don't have technology to physically prevent the damage from the radiation, the ions going through your cells. I mean, to do that physically, you need like a shielding of like water, enough water to prevent the ions to actually get through the hull of the spacecraft into you. And to get that, there's no way you can lift the spacecraft from Earth to do that.
Okay.
Now, to do like a biological shielding, that's again, you can't prevent. Like, I don't know of any kind of biological shield that prevent the ion from going through your cell and causing the DNA damage caused to your cell. Now, for microgravity events like the fluid shifts and things like that, maybe there could be something out there. Again, I think it'd be really tough to do it. I think the key is to come up with something that helps speed up the repair in your body that the damage is done, right? And that in turn will, like, for example, like the mitochondria or those integumenters we use, seems to be speeding up or making the DNA repair activity more efficient. Like, for example, the microRNAs we show is binding to a lot of these DNA repair proteins, which is then obviously detrimental to help repair your DNA that's being damaged. You inhibit those microRNAs, then indeed, the DNA repair back to normal. I was like, okay, good. Same with the mitochondrial activity. If you reduce the reactive oxygen species, boost your energetic signals, then you're speeding up the repair of that's being, or the damage that's being done in your body. So I think that's, for me, that seems to make more sense. But yeah, the biological type shielding, that it could be someone might come up with something in a year. I don't know. If they do, that'd be great. But that's going to be tough to actually get in a human, because I don't think there's any really approved human trials. Then again, you have to go to the human trials to do that. That could be
sometime
10 years.
Yeah. Let me ask you like a quick question. Are there any specific innovations born from space biomedicine over the years that are currently impacting everyday health here on Earth, perhaps without most people even realizing it?
Oh yeah, of course there are. So that's a good question. I'm actually trying to write a book about this.
Cool.
So good timing. So yeah, I mean, the easy part is, you can circle back to like the technology, right? First, because technology, most people know, like your smartphone, for example, that camera in there came from space technology. That is, it was basically a chip created called CMOS, active pixel sensor, where that back in the Apollo missions, space shuttle missions, they wanted to miniaturize a camera. How do they do that? So they came up with this, and now this is widely, if you won't have your phone camera to take snapshots, because of that, or your memory foam mattress, for example, that was derived for space because they wanted to create a padding and stuff. So a bunch of different things that came out, like your Bluetooth headphones, that's things like that. For healthcare already, I mean, for example, your dental X-rays, that was digital imaging that we use. That's actually was developed from deep space telescopes. So when you go to your dentist, you're not just sitting there, thinking I'm going to the dentist. It's like using space age technology, or the invisible braces. That was like basically these aligner, the polycrystalline that's used to create that, Invisalign was actually developed from NASA first, when they were looking at like the missile tracking and how to create material, So, but then there's also drugs like, skincare products, like wrinkle treatments that already have come out from, because, the skin issues like rashes develop when you're in space through the changes in your immune system. So they try to counter that. And that technology from how do you prevent all the skin changes and rashes now is actually being like, oh, it could actually treat wrinkles too. Or prosthetic limbs. That's another one. So prosthetic originally was designed for this like coating that they made and other kind of technology for spaceships. And then some smart person along the way was like, wait a second, that you could use that to actually maybe help humans if they lose a limb or something. So they could keep going, but there's a lot more like, like there's like wound dressing things for stop bleeding, because obviously if you get a wound in space, it's not going to be healed the same way.
Yeah, of course.
So how do you develop to stop the bleeding in emergency, and how do you actually prevent that in that extreme environment? Well, they said they created that, and I was like, we could use that for surgery and emergency products on Earth. So when you go, let's say, have an unfortunate accident and you're bleeding profusely, they have technology from space that they could actually apply to there that prevent that bleeding. And there's some drugs that people have tested, like for bone marrow recovery, because obviously bone degeneration is a huge thing that happens in space. So there's other drugs there that now are being used in the clinic from space radiation research to be like, oh, that helps bone marrow recovery, do that heavy doses you get of radiation. Well, why don't we do that with people who need bone marrow? Because they say if you go to cancer treatment, right? Cancer, for example, when you do the radiation treatment, would impact, it's localized, but still you got bones around there, and that would systemically cause sometimes your bone marrow to be depleted. So how do you get that boosted up? And that. So I can keep going, but there's a lot of things
that's amazing list.
Yeah. There's more there too. But I think now that as we're kind of dubbing the second space age, there's going to be probably a huge advancements where we make from space research that's going to easily, maybe 5 years from now, be like, oh, look at all the list of drugs that we have now that we can apply for certain diseases in the clinic. I mean, already there's a profound amount of things that apply people every day that they don't even realize. Like my glasses, for example, or your glasses has that scratch resistant coating.
Yeah,
that's from basically. They created that originally for the astronaut helmets to prevent space debris coming. So you got the thin diamond coating.
I didn't know that.
Yeah. So your glasses can maybe prevent space debris from damaging your eyes. But things like that. It's neat. That scratch resistant coating might not have been developed as quickly if they didn't have it for the astronaut helmets. So
looking towards the future, what is your overall vision for the field of space biomedicine in the next 20 years?
My vision or the entire field vision?
The entire, like either or. Like, what is your vision? Like 20 years from now, where is the biomedicine field?
20 years from now, I hope, maybe I'm making too much of a sci-fi fantasy of this, but I hope.
Please.
But I think 20 years from now, I think we'll hopefully have more of a human species faring space. Hopefully there'll be a colony on the moon, which I think should be. And hopefully there'll be a colony on Mars, and there might be other places we go. For example, Venus has this Goldilocks zone in the atmosphere where potentially there could be microbes there, because we know there's microbes in the atmosphere. And this one woman, Sarah Seeger, a collaborator at MIT, is launching a probe there to see, is there life there? But then also people hypothesize that maybe we could build like floating cities on that atmosphere, because that is even a better, more suitable condition. Temperature is good, everything's good, than Mars would be, for that. So I would imagine in 20 years, hopefully we'll have these things established, and there might be colonies there, and more missions. Obviously, more and more missions are going to be happening in space, and but the key is making it safe for humans to travel. In 20 years, I think is hopefully plenty of time to get a magic pill cocktail, like you see in sci-fi movies. You pop the pill, I'm okay. Go to space.
Do you remember? Have you seen the movie Contact by Jodie Foster? The philanthropist at the beginning of the movie, he was I think he had some kind of degenerative disease, and he stayed all the time in space. Will that ever happen? Will we have facilities in space to reduce for us to end of life service in space where we can live?
I mean, some people hypothesize, some diseases might that might not be so far-fetched for some things, but I think, if in 20 years, maybe, I mean, if there's a billionaire, they have money to do it. So that they have unlimited resources to do something like that if they wanted to. But I mean, there's definitely signs potentially. Overall, I think though most diseases will be accelerated, so I don't think that will be beneficial if you already have a predisposed disease to be in space. Okay. But you never know.
Are you into science fiction? Do you have a favorite genre, a science fiction book, a movie, anime? What is your?
I think so.
What's your favorite book?
Favorite book, sci-fi book. I have to think about it. I mean, the Foundation series by Isaac Asimov's good. I really like those a lot. Trying to think what other books are there. Some of the cyberpunk, like the William Gibson ones, and
okay, cool.
Dune is one. I love that book too. Like Dune is one of my. I'm sure a lot of people in sci-fi they read that one and like, oh, this is great.
yeah. Dune, I think that it was made as a opposition to Asimov, right? Asimov was thinking about determinism and
exactly.
Dune was,
So I love those ones. Like for movie sci-fi, like just movie genres. I mean, I like both so there's people polarized. Some people like Star Wars. Some people. I like both Star Wars and Star Trek. But like for TV shows, I mean, I think The Expanse is probably one of the best sci-fi realistic TV, sci-fi, space kind of TV shows out there. I think they really did consult someone in the space field when they were looking at health issues, things like that, and how people will adapt. So that was a really, I think, been,
Afshin, what advice would you offer to aspiring researchers, particularly university students, who are interested in contributing to the exciting and interdisciplinary field of space biomedicine?
I think don't limit yourself. Basically, space anything the person's like studying at this point applies to space research. And hopefully, they get this from this. So, even if let's say the graduate program doesn't offer a space biomedicine program, which a lot of them don't, yet then that's okay because they could start working with people like me and many others in the world that work on space biomedicine. And let's say that they would go to genetics, easily applicable to space, as long as they work with people. And then also, don't be closed. Work with. I know as a junior person in research or students, it's kind of more intimidating to reach out to people like me or others. But in the space field, I think, from what I've gathered, for me, if a student sends me an email, I usually reply back. And sometimes students are like, "Well, do we reply?" No, but I have students, undergrads, high school students, graduate students, postdocs, and up higher involved with a lot of my projects because the younger people usually their mind is more creative than the older people who get locked in, and sometimes they're smarter too. So a lot of times, the younger generation, I say, don't be afraid to reach out to the people in the field that are working on things because typically for me, I'll reply back, see if there might be a project they could work on and what their background skills are, and a lot of times they end up, yeah, we could help on this project. And, as long as they don't fail out of school, I said, yeah, help out. And everyone means they could be on publications at that age, on that level of their career, which is beneficial for them. And it helps out and it helps their knowledge and helps me out too. So, but I think there's a lot of people out there like me. The space field seems very welcoming for the younger generations. We all realize we need this field to grow. And there's a lot of unanswered questions.
True. Before we wrap up, is there anything else you'd like to share with our audience?
No, thanks for having me. I think this is a great thing. I think there should be more people like you doing podcasts like this to bring awareness to space and everything. So I think the more people hear about how the key thing is, I think you touched upon at the very end is the question is when people say, well, only a few people go to space. How does this affect me? And I think the key is really understanding that, as we brought up in your last question, is that everything that happens in space really accelerates your everyday life on Earth and health and technology. So it's an important field to be in.
Afshin, it's been an honor to have you here, and thank you so much for sharing your insights and expertise.
Yeah,
and
you.
To everyone listening, this is Omar Alayli podcast. Thanks for joining us, and keep exploring.